Hello, my name is Neely Young. Recently, Professor Ty Seidule, author of Robert E. Lee and Me, presented a critical appraisal of General Lee to a Washington and Lee audience of faculty and students. He alleged that Lee was a traitor who resigned from the U.S. Army to lead Confederate forces. The primary goal of the Confederacy, Seidule claims, was the subjugation and enslavement of Black Americans. Today, two Washington and Lee graduates with doctorates in history and credentials as research scholars respond to General Seidule's factually flawed presentation. I am the author of two scholarly books on Rockbridge County and Blacks during and after the Civil War. Professor Eckes has published 9 books on U.S. economic and political history. He has also researched 19th century documents and newspapers and written about Lee's Civil War, post-Civil War record. Both believe that Professor Seidule has presented a distorted picture of Lee to those considering the future of our university. In this video presentation, we will highlight some of these factual errors and analytical mistakes.
Hello, everyone. First question I propose, did General Lee actually run a slave farm, whip slaves, and break families apart, as Seidule asserts? Those claims relate to Arlington House, which Lee's wife inherited from her father. The estate had numerous slaves, and Robert E. Lee was designated the executor. By the terms of his father's will in 1857, Lee was required to pay off the debts on the estate and to free all of the slaves within 5 years. The Army granted Lee a furlough to pay off as much of the debts on the estate as possible and to begin the emancipation of the slaves. He did so. The accusation that Lee was a cruel slaveholder who whipped Black slaves rests on thin evidence. The charge appeared in one abolitionist newspaper before the Civil War. It was repeated in another after the war. These newspapers had an anti-Lee agenda. There is no corroborating evidence. Lee himself denied the claims, saying, "There is not a word of truth in it. No servant, soldier, or citizen that was ever employed by me can with truth charge me with bad treatment." Thus, the image of Lee as a cruel Simon Legree, whipping slaves and working them to death, is one perpetuated by abolitionist propaganda and dubious sources, not sound historical research.
Incidentally, Lee did not own any slave after the early 1850s. His son said that he had freed all of the slaves, which he inherited from his mother by that point, and it was his wife who owned the slaves, which she had inherited from her father. Did Lee break up slave families? As executor of the estate, Lee did, quote, hire out slaves from time to time, but this was a fairly common practice. In Lee's case, he hired out slaves for specific periods of time so that the debts on the estate could be paid and the slaves freed. All of these slaves were reunited with their families as soon as possible. This is proven by looking at the inventory of the Custis estate in 1857 and comparing it with Lee's Emancipation Decree of December 1862, which lists all of the slave families and their location. What about Seidule's claim that Lee committed treason to protect and expand slavery? Lee states that Lee fought for slavery, not to protect Virginia. This is nonsense. Lee's decision first to resign from the U.S. Army and later to accept a commission in the Virginia State Militia had nothing to do with slavery. He wanted to protect his home state from invasion. When a close advisor to President Lincoln offered Lee command of the Union Army in 1861, he declined, saying, "I look upon secession as anarchy. If I owned the 4 million of slaves at the South, I would sacrifice them all to the Union. But how can I draw my sword upon Virginia, my native state?
This may surprise some in the 21st century, but until the Civil War settled the issue of secession, there was respectable opinion that states could withdraw from the Union. Lee himself was no fan of slavery. On a number of occasions before the war, he described it as a moral evil. There are numerous statements on the record from Lee that he did not resign from the Army to perpetuate slavery, but instead to defend his native state. Was Lee guilty of treason for resigning and taking up arms against the Union, as Seidule alleges? Many Northerners thought so during the Civil War, and perhaps some of the literal-minded think so today. But the issue has been rendered moot. In 1975, the Congress of the United States and President Ford opted to restore Lee's citizenship posthumously. At the time, President Ford said, "General Lee's character has been an example to succeeding generations, making the restoration of his citizenship an event in which every American can take pride." Incidentally, among those in the Senate who voted unanimously to restore Lee's citizenship was then Senator Joseph Biden of Delaware. More relevant to the present issue of renaming Washington and Lee University is Lee's conduct as president of Washington College from 1865 to 1870. Neely, you've examined that aspect of Lee's career closely. What do you think?
Seidule states that Washington College students routinely assaulted black people, particularly black women. The implication is that Lee looked the other way or did nothing about it. Seidule's assertions are contradicted by resources in the Washington and Lee archives and by my own research. First of all, the statement that Washington College students, quote, routinely assaulted black people is not proven by the historical record. Second, I have shown in an earlier piece, which I wrote, that in every case where it was demonstrated that students behaved badly, Lee reacted swiftly and appropriately, either through suspension, expulsion, or allowing a student to withdraw. He also cooperated fully with local and federal authorities and encouraged them to do their job. According to David Cox in his book, The Religious Life of Robert E. Lee, quote, his influence helped to dissipate one lynch mob aimed at a black man and another aimed at a white. Lee specifically condemned bad behavior and on several occasions forbade students to participate in demonstrations or acts of violence.
It's worth remembering that Lee was ahead of his times when it came to the education of blacks. The prominent black leader of the late 19th century, Booker T. Washington, who himself was born into slavery, would later praise Lee for his efforts to educate Negroes through the medium of the Sunday school. He said that Lee was one of the first white people in America, certainly the first in the South, to exhibit interest in reaching the Negro and saving his soul. Seidule's criticisms of Lee focus narrowly on his activities before and during the Civil War. He largely ignores or minimizes Lee's efforts to promote national reconciliation and better education after becoming president of Washington College. But these were the primary reasons that so many leaders, North and South, honored Robert E. Lee. Individuals as different as General Grant and Booker T. Washington praised Lee for his contributions to peace and reconciliation.
The current website for the Museum of History and Culture in Virginia states the following: Lee decided to work during the post-war period to restore the country. He preached submission to authority and promoted political harmony. Lee's greatest post-war legacy was toward national reconciliation. He became a voice of moderation and patient compliance. In his public letters, several of which were reprinted in newspapers, he urged that all should unite in honest efforts to obliterate the effects of war and to restore the blessings of peace. He vowed to do all in my power to encourage our people to set manfully to work to restore the country. When Congress ordered the drafting of new constitutions in the southern states, Lee announced that it was the duty of the Southern people to accept the situation fully. When other Confederate leaders threatened to leave the country, Lee urged them to remain in their native states and work toward reconciliation. In a comment to a bitter Confederate widow, Lee said, "Abandon your animosities and make your sons Americans." Generations of American historians have recognized Lee's post-war contributions to the effort of reconciliation, as have many American presidents, including Teddy Roosevelt, Franklin D. Roosevelt, Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, John F. Kennedy, and Gerald Ford. President Teddy Roosevelt celebrated Lee's post-war accomplishments by saying, "From the close of the war to the time of his death, all his great powers were devoted to two objects: the reconciliation of all his countrymen with one another and fitting the youth of the South for the duties of a lofty and broad-minded citizenship." His cousin, FDR, called Lee one of our greatest American gentlemen.
In light of Brigadier General Seidule's assertions, it's worth remembering what five-star General of the Army Dwight D. Eisenhower, himself a West Point graduate, had to say about Lee. He considered Lee one of four greatest Americans. Ike hung a picture of Lee in the Oval Office while he was president. He explained that Lee was one of the supremely gifted men produced by our nation, selfless almost to a fault, noble as a leader and as a man. The other reasons our forebears revered Lee for his post-Civil War accomplishments relate to Washington College. Dr. Seidule may not appreciate that without Robert E. Lee's leadership and fundraising skills, the struggling Washington College of 1865 might have closed its doors forever. Before the war, it averaged only 88 students. With Lee as president, student enrollment quadrupled. 80% came from outside Virginia, including several international students. The charismatic Lee proved himself a successful fundraiser. According to educational historians, he presided over a fundraising juggernaut. In 2 years, he doubled the endowment. His fundraising attracted money from Northern cultural and business leaders. The money allowed him to construct new buildings, to hire new faculty, to broaden and expand the curriculum. When Lee arrived in Lexington in 1865, each student was required to study 4 years of Latin and Greek. Lee perceived the need to teach subjects that would prepare the leaders for the New South. He added a journalism program and a law school and courses in business. He strengthened the natural sciences and engineering. He recruited faculty from major colleges in the North. He added modern foreign languages like French and Spanish. It's not surprising, then, that present-day historians of education consider President Lee an innovative college leader who secured the college's future. They say that Washington College, under Lee's leadership, was progressive, embodying a vision of a new South. Professor Seidule seems to think that Lee established a shrine to the lost cause in Lexington, and that his values of honor and behavior are no longer relevant to this university and current generations. He claims that Washington and Lee today is better than General Lee. Neely, how do you react to that?
Al, I absolutely believe that Lee is as relevant today as he was 150 years ago. His values are the values of our university and its graduates. When asked about the Washington and Lee honor system and Lee's contribution, Seidule merely points out that there was an honor system at the college before the war. No one has ever claimed that Lee invented the honor system, but here are the facts. Number one, there was a pre-war honor system, but it was often honored more in the breach than in the observance, and was not in place throughout the entire period. Number two, although there may have been some student participation in the pre-war system, it was primarily run by the faculty. Number three, in any case, the pre-war system had disappeared by the time Lee arrived. And number four, Lee brought with him elements of the West Point honor system, which he had known as a cadet and as superintendent. This included the single sanction and a student-run system, which were fully in place at Washington College before his death. Most important, Lee epitomized the honor system in his own life and character. This is demonstrated through his maxim that every student should behave as a gentleman. Thus, there can be no doubt that the honor system which we practice today is the direct legacy of Robert E. Lee. Now, as for the lost cause myth, there's no doubt today that proponents of the lost cause in the 1930s and even earlier turned Lee into the marble man who could do no wrong and epitomized only the best of the Southern chivalric tradition. But it is also true that Seidule and others, such as historian Eric Foner of Columbia University and journalist Tony Losey of the Washington and Lee faculty, depict Lee as a man who could do no right and who was a dishonorable, racist traitor. This again is nonsense. The Lost Cause attempted to show that the Civil War was not about slavery at all, but about other considerations. The new narrative, or mythology, attempts to show that the Civil War was only about slavery and that other factors such as states' rights, constitutional questions about secession, economic differences between the various sections of the country played no role. As we have shown, Seidule, Losey, and the other proponents of cancel culture history operate in a narrow tunnel of presentism and do not present a balanced assessment of Lee and his many contributions to our university. Why should Washington and Lee, with its fabled past, turn its back on tradition and become, as some recommend, another left-wing university divorced from its roots? Al, what do you think?
Neely, it seems to me that much of Seidule's narrative is based on a hasty reading of several authors, especially Elizabeth Pryor's book. It is not the product of careful, first-hand research in primary sources such as letters and documents. This book does not display the hand of an experienced Civil War-era researcher. In attacking Lee's reputation, Seidule embraces the woke history of racial justice as the central theme in American history. He largely ignores the complex political, legal, and cultural history of the Civil War and Reconstruction eras. Thus, he does not successfully attack the real reasons for honoring President Lee in 1870, his contributions to national reconciliation and education in the South. I want to conclude with a caveat. As a colonel in the history department at West Point, colleagues say that Ty Seidule fondly rephrased Mark Twain's famous aphorism about three kinds of lies. He said there are lies, damn lies, and generals' memoirs. Perhaps we should remember his warning about the unreliability of generals' memoirs when we reflect on General Seidule's own woke revisionist memoir and its criticisms of Robert E. Lee.